On the first day in Geneva, Kerry and Lavrov gathered everyone into a large room in the Intercontinental Hotel and divided the technical experts into two working groups, one for legal issues and the other to tackle the logistical challenges involved in destroying Syria's chemical stockpile. But the US representatives quickly ran into a problem. There were no Russians on the other side with whom to negotiate. Lavrov had arrived in Geneva with a small handful of deputies and only then discovered that his side was outnumbered and overmatched. More aides were summoned from Moscow, but these began to trickle in only after the talks were well into the second day. The Americans took advantage of the extra 24 hours to fine tune their strategy. It was a safe bet that the Russians would press for as many delays as possible, so the Americans prepared to battle against any stalling that might allow Syria to drag out the disarmament process in the hope that the rest of the world would eventually lose interest. Robert Mikulak, the Obama administration's ambassador to the OPCW, had begun drafting the text of a resolution that could be endorsed by the organization's executive council, legally committing Syria to eliminate its weapons on an aggressive timetable. Rebecca Hersman, the Pentagon's chief representative and the deputy assistant secretary in charge of weapons of mass destruction policy, sat down with him to help. Diplomats rehearsed their arguments for what everyone assumed would be a grinding, line by line slugfest over how and how quickly Syria's chemical weapons would be destroyed. But when the talks began in earnest on the second day, the Americans found many of their Russian counterparts, a mix of uniformed military officers and civilian technocrats, to be curiously quiescent. There was little quibbling over the essential facts of Syria's weapons program, and surprisingly little pushback on proposed schedules and timelines for the destruction. The Russians as a group showed scant enthusiasm for the task at hand, but they marched in lockstep to the cadence set by Lavrov and other senior Kremlin officials. Moscow appeared to want a deal, and they would do their part to deliver one. In the logistics working group, the leader for the US side, Thomas Countryman, the State Department's top non proliferation official, decided that the Russians and Americans should start by mutually agreeing on the size of the problem. How many tons of chemical weapons the Assad regime actually possessed? A US official gave a rough sketch describing the CIA's current thinking about the quantity of poisons in Syria's stockpile and where they were kept. Then it was the Russians' turn, and the Americans waited to hear what Syria's closest military ally, one that had helped equip Assad's army and frequently visited its military bases, had to say. The official from Moscow blandly offered a substantially smaller figure, but then quickly assented to the American view. That's more than we thought, but maybe you're right, the Russian said through an interpreter. Months later, evidence from Syria would show the CIA's estimates to be remarkably accurate. though the Americans could never be certain about what new facilities and weapons, if any, Assad had created in the years since the death of the CIA's chemist spy. A simple compromise settled the potentially contentious question of how quickly Syria's arsenal would be destroyed. After considering competing suggestions of 6 months and 12 months, the experts split the difference and decided that the stockpile should be eliminated by the end of June, just over 9 months away. Even at the compromise date, the pace required to meet the deadline was, as Countryman later acknowledged, on the border between feasible and insane. Significant classes did erupt over how serious chemicals should be eliminated. Countryman's negotiators tried to prod the Russians into agreeing to do the physical collecting and destroying of serious poisons on their own, with international oversight. The idea made logical sense. The Russians, as Assad's trusted ally, would have easier access to Syria's weapons factories. Moreover, Moscow already had a navy base in Syria, in the port city of Tartus, and it would be relatively easy to load the chemicals onto a navy vessel and ship them across the Black Sea to Russia, where they could be destroyed in any of six modern plants built over the past decade to eliminate Russia's Soviet era chemical stockpile. In addition, after some quick digging through intelligence files, Countryman's team had discovered that the Russian army once fielded an entire brigade devoted solely to neutralizing chemical weapons, using a fleet of specialized vehicles that could destroy sarin and other nerve agents on the spot. Why not take those vehicles out of storage and put them to use in Syria? The Russians were asked. The experts from the Kremlin refused. It was impossible for Russia to accept Syria's weapons, they said, because importing toxic chemicals was illegal under the country's laws. Whether the claim was technically true or not, it struck the Americans as a dubious excuse, since Russia's strongman president could surely grant himself an exemption if he wanted to. As for the brigade and its specialized vehicles, the Russians initially seemed baffled, but the Americans persisted and supplied additional details until at last a different answer was relayed back from Moscow. That brigade has been abandoned for years, was the reply. When it was the United States' turn to present ideas, the most important task fell to Jeff Harris, a mechanical engineer who worked with steam blades. Harris had flown in from the Edgewood Army Base near Baltimore to brief the Russians on the Americans' new invention. At that moment, six of the new Margarita machines sat in a warehouse in Maryland, ready to go. The first mentions of the Pentagon's new field deployable hydrolysis system had elicited puzzled expressions and even scoffs from the Kremlin's experts in Geneva. Totally impossible, was the Russian verdict in one of the early high level sessions. But when it was time for Harris's presentation, the men in uniform crowded into a conference room for a chance to see what the fuss was about. Speaking through an interpreter and using a colored diagram as a prop, Harris stood before a row of stern faced Russians and began to describe the device's modular features and how the machine could be quickly taken apart, transported in standard shipping containers, and set up almost anywhere on an airfield tarmac, on a harbor pier, or wherever there was a flat piece of turf and a convenient water source. Using the schematic, he traced the flow of liquid nerve agents through the machine and into the maze of pipes and valves where the toxic molecules would be bombarded with a stream of scalding water. Then he showed how the neutralized leftovers were pumped into a wastewater tank to be taken away for treatment elsewhere. Among the Russians, one retired general appeared to follow the presentation with particular interest. When Harris finished speaking, the man, a former operator of chemical weapons destruction plants in Russia and a venerated member of the delegation, judging from the deference the others accorded him, peppered the American with technical questions. When he had carefully gone through all these, he sat back, apparently satisfied. "This will work," he said in English.